Jim Lowen first became aware of Richard Thornton's intimate knowledge of the southern Appalachian Mountains in June 2010, when Richard wrote a series of articles about his experiences when camping in the Chattahoochee National Forest with homeless veterans. They were featured in the national edition of The Examiner. Then in 2013, while watching a rerun of the premiere of America Unearthed, which featured Richard, Jim realized that this Richard was the same one who had written about the lives of homeless veterans. Jim struck up an email friendship with Richard. Then, when the weather was pretty, he and his wife Susan decided to pay the Georgia mountains a visit. They had never been there. They took an Amtrak train to downtown Atlanta, then rented a car to drive up to Dahlonega. Richard didn't want them to see where he lived, so met them in the city's historic downtown. Initially, Jim wanted to interview Richard about the sundown towns. Those were southern towns that made African American visitors leave before dark. Richard didn't know much about the subject. The conversation during the two-day visit soon shifted to the strange events that occurred in northern Georgia in the months leading up to the broadcast of the American Unearthed premiere. Jim and Susan were astounded by the bizarre behavior of the U.S. Forest Service and National Security Agency employees. He asked repeatedly, "You mean my tax payments funded this nonsense?" Jim and Susan urged Richard not to abandon his research into America's Native American history, even though they well understood that he received no income from that effort. Jim also advised Richard not to put any energy into trying to change the minds of the archaeologists in Georgia. It would likely be a fruitless quest and would merely feed their egos. He advised Richard to go onto the national stage, but to do that his writing style would be on par with graduates of such institutions as Harvard and Berkeley. Shortly after they returned home to Bethesda, Maryland, Jim began periodically critiquing Richard's articles in The Examiner and his own People of One Fire website. Sometimes he would get a "good job." Other times, Richard would be told that he was really onto something, but needed to do more research before anyone would be convinced. He would also sometimes get a message like, "Richard, you can do better than this. No one who counts is going to take you seriously if you have bad grammar and misspelling." We will now turn the helm of the ship over to Richard for him to explain the research process that he has used over the past 12 years.
Hello, this is Richard Thornton, your tour guide into the past of the southern Appalachian Mountains. This program is coming to you from the Nacoochee Valley in northeast Georgia, the largest and most densely occupied archaeological zone north of Mexico. Mankind has lived here continuously from the Ice Age to the present. I am standing in a field that has grown cultivated plants for at least 5,500 years. What looks like a wooded hill in back of me is the site of the Temple of Amana, the sun goddess, and the location where the Roanoke colony survivor, Eleanor Dare, spent the last decade of her life. Further behind me is Sal Mountain, an extinct volcano. In 1828, the riverbank behind it became the official starting point of our nation's first major gold rush. Gold still can be panned from that location. It's washed down from the mountains where the Chattahoochee River begins. Before taking you on a tour into the past, I'd like to explain the philosophy that guides my research. My fellowship in Mexico was just the beginning of a lifetime of exploration and learning. Fortunately, my faculty advisor at Georgia Tech required me to keep a daily journal of all my experiences, not just the pre-Columbian architecture. I was also required to take at least 2,500 slides to document these experiences. You see, that's the point. I am still learning from those memories that were documented 53 years ago. If a scholar is truly honest, there is no time when he or she can claim to know the whole truth. I might learn something tomorrow that will change what I thought was the truth yesterday. Therefore, I have no theories, just a steadily increasing stockpile of evidence. Therefore, the remainder of this program will be presented in chronological order, beginning in the months leading up to the premiere of America Unearthed on December 21st, 2012. As stated in Part 1, when I published the article on Track Rock Gap in the December 21st, 2011 Examiner, I viewed it as a filler article for the holidays before I got back to writing articles on historic preservation. I hope to use these articles as a diving board for for taking the plunge back into a full-time architecture practice. Once I realized that I was being hit with broadside from both the Georgia archaeologists and the occultists and the U.S. Forest Service, I knew that I needed to put all of my research in a published book. The truth was, however, that I learned a lot by doing research that was focused on a specific region. I never before had even considered the possibility that there might be Maya colonists in the southern Appalachians. Chiaha was a large town on an island at the edge of the Great Smoky Mountains. It was visited by both the DeSoto and Pardo expeditions. I had never really looked at the word. The Spanish chroniclers said this province grew vast fields of grain salvia along the rivers. Chiaha means Salvia River in Itzamaya. Chiapas State's name means Salvia Place of. The Travel Channel had been given immediate approval for filming a program on the Track Rock ruins. They sent a small crew from Asheville, North Carolina, to interview me at the site on March the 1st. I thought it was odd that this film company specialized in programs on the paranormal and murder mysteries. 3 days later, I electronically transmitted the book's manuscript to my publisher. The following week, I was shocked to see an obituary for Susan Muse in the Blairsville newspaper. She had died at the very moment that the filming had started at Track Rock Gap. Those viewers who have watched Part 1 may recall that Susan Muse was a friend of mine from church in my high school days. She accompanied me to the 9FU14 archaeological site one Sunday. Dr. Arthur Kelly had asked me to examine burials exposed by Utor Creek, which had recently flooded. At a distance, we observed a man we knew inserting a stolen stone hoe into the mound being excavated under the supervision of Arthur Kelly. A University of Georgia professor had made statements to the Atlanta Journal-Constitution that suggested Dr. Kelly was the prime suspect. Our testimony to the police cleared Dr. Kelly of any suspicion. Susan went on to become a nationally respected artist and art educator. I called her when I got into the chicken house. The office where I lived had a telephone and internet service. She said that she had lived in Blairsville most of her life, but a couple of years earlier she had received anonymous death threats from some neo-Nazis living north of Blairsville. They had also vandalized her car, almost causing her to have a serious accident. She and her partner had then moved to an adjacent county. Because Susan had a man living wherever, I never actually saw her in person while I was living in Blairsville. That same week I received an email from a lady in Asheville who had lived near our farm in the Reems Creek Valley. She was 14 years younger than me, and I was married, so she was just an acquaintance back then. She told me she'd recently divorced and had always had a crush on me. She asked if we could meet for lunch in Franklin, North Carolina, which is between Blairsville and Asheville. I said yes. I was very lonely and had no friends in Union County. Being basically homeless and living in a chicken house does not attract women to be beating down one's door. Early in the morning of the planned date, I found screws in 2 of my tires. I filled them up in Fix-A-Flat and headed to a tire shop and repair garage near the old courthouse. Something was odd. They had unoccupied bays, but instead drove the Explorer into a small bay enclosed on all sides for painting cars, then shut the overhead door. They seemed to take an awful long time to patch 2 tires, but eventually the car was ready to drive. I went back to the chicken house to pick up the dogs and then headed north towards Murphy, North Carolina. As I drove through Murphy, I noticed that a black pickup with black windows and a black van with black windows had pulled in beside me. The pickup had 3 dog cages in the back. The highway between Murphy and Franklin has spectacular views as one passes over the crest of the Nantahala Mountains. It is also one of the most dangerous roads in western North Carolina because it climbs steeply up to 5,400 feet. There are sections of highway that go straight down the slope several hundred feet, as shown here, then suddenly twist like a snake. I noticed that my steering wheel was rattling increasingly as I went up the slopes on the west side. Then the steering wheel began to become increasingly more unresponsive as I went down the even more dangerous east side. Just as I got to the base of the mountain, my entire steering wheel assembly and column fell into my lap. The ignition key and turn signal were attached to the column. I could not steer the car nor turn the motor off. In the rearview mirror, I saw a tractor-trailer barreling down toward me. I intentionally braked the car to make it skid off the road. Yikes! There was an auto repair garage with a tow truck in sight. When I got the Explorer into the bay, the owner asked me, "Hey, mister, what did you do to tick off the Brotherhood? You're the first person I've seen that wasn't dead or near dead when they did this to them. I asked him, what is the Brotherhood? He just smirked at me. The repairs cost me over $500, but he got them finished almost before lunchtime. The woman from Asheville was quite attractive, but initially seemed surprised to see both me and the car in one piece. She quickly slipped back into her acting role. You see, within a minute after we sat down at the country-style restaurant, I realized that she was an imposter. The real woman's older sister worked at our goat dairy during the summer vacations while she was in college. This woman didn't know that. I do remember the real woman's teeny bopper sister coming by the farm one time and giving me Google eyes. I remained polite, but left for Blairsville after the meal. The black pickup and the van were waiting for me on the side of the Murphy Highway. I was surprised to see that they had North Carolina license plates, not Georgia plates. The two black vehicles tried to run me off the road a few times, but only accomplished putting themselves in grave danger. They turned right onto another highway when we got into Murphy. A couple of days later, I dropped by my two rental storage bins to pick up some personal items. The bin containing my canoe, ceramic kiln, and some valuable family heirloom furniture was empty. It was time for me to move to the south side of the Georgia mountains. As you were told in part 1, my financial situation improved radically after the publication of my article in Track Rock Gap. However, I still could not find a place to move to south of the mountains. Meanwhile, I was in a very frustrating situation professionally in that the U.S. Forest Service and the Cherokee tribe in North Carolina were blocking nationally respected networks from filming at Track Rock Gap. National Geographic, PBS, BBC, and Univision walked away from the project when denied permission to film there. However, the History Channel executives became highly irritated when people claiming to be Cherokees made phone calls and sent emails that threatened to conjure demons against the network. There was no name for the series, but History Channel executives authorized committee films to move ahead with the concept of a pilot about the Track Rock Terrace Complex and Mayas immigrating to North America. They were to come up with a strategy to bypass actually going on the archaeological site. The film company was located in the suburb of Minneapolis, Minnesota. Committee Films asked for a copy of my book, then asked to use my photographs of the site, my three-dimensional site plan, and John Haskell's 2011 videos of the site. The concept of the project was to broaden the investigation of the Maya immigration question beyond just Track Rock itself and to rely on Mexican archaeologists to counter the statements of the Georgia archaeologists, most of whom had never even seen the Track Rock ruins and obviously had a cartoonish knowledge of Maya cultural history based on their high school geography textbooks. The lead spokesman for the archaeologists had never even been in Mexico. In the meantime, I had found a place to move to, near Dahlonega, Georgia, so I'd be living 57 miles from the Track Rock Gap at the time of the filming. The house looked nice in the photos sent me the owner. It was on a 130-acre tract of land, so having 3 dogs with me would be no problem. Most landlords in the Dahlonega area had refused to rent their house to me because of the 3 dogs. The only part of the house interior that I'd seen before moving day was actually this photo of the damage to the fireplace, but I'd repaired much worse situation in my farmhouse in Virginia, so I was not particularly concerned about having a problem there. May 1st, moving day arrived. First, the moving company relocated all of my surviving personal items and furniture from a storage bin in Blairsville to a storage bin in Dahlonega. So the 3 dogs and I jumped in the Explorer and excitedly headed south to finally have a real home after almost 2.5 years of basically camping out. Oh my gosh, the place was a disaster. The front had been torn off when the fire started, and evidently by the firemen. The place was completely filled with furniture and clothing and whatever. I couldn't even move into the house. I soon figured out that the reason that the tenants had put too much firewood in the fireplace was because the furnace and the air conditioner didn't work. Rats had eaten so many holes in the heating ducts that the systems wouldn't function. Then I learned that actually they were not the last tenants. 3 months before then, the owner's 25-year-old daughter had been forced to move into the house when her home in Dahlonega was repossessed. She was a realtor like so many other people in the real estate construction industry. She had lost her home. Pretty much the same situation as me. The difference is that roughly 2 days into the house, she took a heavy dose of drugs and then drove her pickup truck over a cliff. No one had been in the house since then. Basically, what I walked into is the appearance of the house, and the lady went out driving over a pickup. Her clothing was still on the mattress. I mean, it was just like she walked out the door and didn't come back. So I had to box up the deceased woman's clothing and personal belongings and transport them over to her father's house before even I could move my clothing in. Very macabre situation. After moving in, I learned from the owner that he expected me to pay for the building materials, something I could not afford, at least in the first month or two. So the best I could do is clean up around the house in the following weeks, and I decided to build a terrace garden off the side of the house where we could film the show without seeing how horrible the house was. I begged Committee Films not to produce the program in my wretched cabin, but they insisted, and about 10 days before the scheduled filming I received at the posh home of a successful architect. After seeing the wretched conditions that I lived in, the plot was modified to that I was a poorly educated, eccentric hillbilly who had somehow come up with this idea that the Mayas had come to Georgia without having any justification for it. Even in the final form, it was never mentioned I had 8 years of college, had written the book that the program was based on, and was architect of the Trail of Tears mural. The morning of filming arrived. The Travel Channel had utilized a cameraman and a reporter. I was expecting something not much more than that. Was absolutely terrified when 8 vehicles pulled up to my cabin. Notice here that the program always described me as an expert on the Creek Indians, not as a Creek Indian. Actually, I'm a member of a state-recognized Creek tribe and descendant of several Creek leaders who signed treaties with Great Britain. Also, the public was never told that all of my Native American DNA comes from south of the border. Part of it's Maya, part of it's other ethnic groups in southern Mexico and eastern Peru. But that's a very important point that was never even mentioned. I was interviewed and filmed for about 6.5 hours that day, yet only maybe 5-7 minutes appears on the 1-hour program that the public saw. They left out much of my research and my explanation of the complexity of the situation, and that the Mayas were just one of the peoples who came to northern Georgia and mixed with others to become the Creek Indians. The rental house faced a paved county-maintained road, and the entrance to the driveway was only about 100 feet from a major state highway, but the film company made the viewers think that it was at the end of a long, winding dirt trail. That's some of the tricks that TV companies do. Keeping with the hillbilly theme of the program's original concept, the first thing viewers saw was a sign that I'd forgotten to take over the door and raw wiring, giving the effect that this was really a derelict house. Then the viewers heard ominous music and saw this. I cringed when I saw it on the TV screen. Viewers were never told that I just moved into the house and I was in the midst of restoring it. That would have given a very different impression of my credibility. It was obvious in my initial dialogue that I was nervous, but after a while I developed rapport with Scott Walter, and everything went very smoothly throughout the remainder of the program. Do you remember in part 1 the surrealistic crossing of life paths that occurred at the Maya city of Palenque? That strange chain of events continued into the year 2012. A type of diatomaceous clay called attapulgite is a key ingredient that makes Mesoamerican stucco and murals survive so long in harsh tropical conditions. This is particularly true for the Maya blue pigment that you see on this mural. My book on Track Rock speculated that since Georgia contained the largest deposits of attapulgite in the Americas, and Mexico has very little attapulgite, and Georgia is the nearest major source, it was likely that Mesoamericans came to Georgia to mine attapulgite. America Unearthed presents this fact as a Scott Walters brilliant idea. The Instituto Nacional de Antropología y Historia de Mexico would allow Scott Walter to obtain one sample from one building in one city, Palenque, of all places. Scott elected to obtain a sample of Atapulgite from one mine in Georgia. I thought it was sure folly. The probability of one spot on one building in one Maya city matching one sample in Georgia was minuscule. There's virtually no mica in southern Mexico. The Mayas used vast quantities of mica as reinforcement for their stucco, on murals, and as cosmetics for the royalty. Again, Georgia is the nearest source for the largest deposits of mica. This was not discussed in America Unearthed's premiere, but was discussed extensively in the 95% of my filmed interview that never got into the broadcast. Until watching the premiere, I knew nothing about what the film crew did in Mexico. I was astounded to see archaeologist Alfonso Morelos being interviewed extensively on the program. His father, Moses Morelos, had been my tour guide at Palenque during my fellowship long ago. There's even more irony. Alfonso's parents owned the Palenque Inn, which at that time was an inexpensive hostel for college students, archaeologists, and anyone staying more than a day in Palenque. At the time, Alfonso was an adolescent and served our table at the inn's restaurant. His Canadian mother cooked the meals. When Scott asked Alfonso what he thought about the theory that Maya colonists settled in Georgia, he responded, "It is not a theory, it's a fact. We have recently found inscriptions at Chichen Itza that describe visits by important chiefs from Florida and Georgia to Chichen Itza." Scott telephoned me early on Sunday morning, October 14th, to tell me that there was a 100% match between the Maya blue stucco at Palenque and the Atapulgite from Georgia, combined with Alfonso's statement about Chichen Itza that cinched the Georgia-Maya connection. Unfortunately, most Georgians wouldn't know that for 7 years. Someone put political pressure on the cable and satellite TV providers to black out the premiere in most of the state. After the Travel Channel bought the rights to reruns of America Unearthed in 2019, it ran the program numerous times in Georgia. Suddenly, I was a hero. Fortunately, by that time, I owned an attractive cottage on a large tract of land in the Nacoochee Valley. Those of you who have watched the premiere of America Unearthed may recall something a little odd at the end. The program seemingly has stated its conclusions. Then Scott Walter returns to the discussion of the Lidar scans of Track Rock Terrace Complex. He learns from the surveyors who carried out the scan from an airplane that the physical features identified by Lidar exactly matched those which identified using U.S. Geological Survey data, a GPS surveying device, and a laser surveying device. This determination was especially important because the Maya myth-busting in the mountains folks claimed that there were no plazas, building ruins, or water control structures on the mountainside. They were just terraces. The History Channel film crew heard strange sounds coming from my garden and recorded them. The soundtrack was used in the opening scenes of the program when Scott Walters is in the Chattahoochee National Forest, then again during the opening scenes when he arrives at my home and surveys the terrace garden. I had seen what I thought was fat black snakes shooting under the bags of garbage in the house's crawl space. It was only much later in the summer of 2012 that I realized that these were the largest lizards I'd ever seen in Georgia. They had dug tunnels from the crawl space under the house to the garden and created a tunnel network in the garden, which enabled them to feast on parasitic insects and worms. It was even later that I did research and discovered that these lizards are supposed to live only in the sections of Central America and southern Mexico where the Mayas traditionally lived. Later on, I had conversations with residents of rural Lumpkin County who had the same species of Maya black skink living under their house or in the barns they had. Note that unlike the virtually all other lizards, these giant skinks nurture and feed their babies in the same manner that birds do. So, even though most of the people in Georgia didn't know it, we had proven the Mayas had come to Georgia often over many centuries. They carried their pet black skinks with them up to the new homeland in order to get rid of the pest in their gardens. The fact that there are several major rivers in lower southeast with Itzamaya names proved that at least some of these visitors remained and became many of the ancestors of the Creek Indians, but not all. There were still several major pieces missing from the jigsaw puzzle at the end of 2012. Numerous Spanish, French, and British explorers in the 1500s and the 1600s described seeing temples or even most of the buildings in a town coated with gold or silver particles. Yet when French Marines and traders or British traders entered the interior of North America in the late 1600s and early 1700s, they made no mention of golden buildings. We have accumulated a wealth of evidence that the Mayas came or migrated to the southeastern United States many times over several centuries, yet absolutely no evidence of any buildings sheathed in gold. It would not seem plausible that so many early explorers and even indigenous inhabitants of the southeast would describe seeing golden buildings. On the other hand, no gold has been unearthed at Track Rock Gap. In the latter half of the 20th century, archaeologists in the southeastern United States developed an orthodoxy which assumed that once Native Americans in their region ceased to be migratory hunters, they remained in the same locale until forced to move by the United States in the early 19th century. Stark changes in architecture, pottery, and art were labeled cultural phases of the same populations. I just couldn't buy that. The complex evidence that I've amassed suggested periodic migrations and mixing with many peoples from many parts of the world, including from across the Atlantic Ocean, long before Columbus.
We will now look at some important information from French explorers in the southeastern United States. As a rule, the French were able to maintain much better relations with Native Americans and thus were able to reside with them much longer periods of time, which in turn enabled them to know much more about the cultural traditions and languages. In 1564 and 1565, Lieutenant La Roche-Ferrière led a small body of enlisted men from Fort Caroline up the May River in a generally northwestward direction. They picked out a site for the future capital of New France on a natural terrace, where the University of Georgia is now located. They then continued to its source in present-day Gainesville, Georgia, about 2 days' walk from the Appalachian Mountains. The expedition lasted about 6 months. Once in the Appalachia capital, which is now called the Nacoochee Valley, they conducted a treaty with the king of Appalachia and proceed to explore his realm in northern Georgia. They noted that the temples, public buildings and homes of the Appalachia elite were coated in either gold or silver grains. The map above, painted by Fort Caroline's resident artist and cartographer, Jacques Lemoyne, notes that grains of silver could be harvested from the pool beneath what is now called Anna Ruby Falls, near Helen, Georgia. There is another note above it, stating that gold could be generally found throughout the Appalachian Mountains.
The premiere of America Unearthed focused on the immigration of the Mayas from southern Mexico, but even in 2012 I knew that was only one part of the story. I just couldn't figure out what the other missing pieces of the jigsaw puzzle were. One by one over the next decade, these answers would appear. This was because I always was following the evidence, not trying to prove that I knew everything that there was to know. In the spring of 2013, I was contacted via email by a linguist who was a graduate of Boston University. She had found a book published during 1658 in French that had languished away in the fantasy and utopia bin of the John Carter Brown Library at Brown University in Providence, Rhode Island. The book was by French natural scientist, historian, and Protestant minister Charles de Rochefort. In the mid-1600s, he was assigned to be the minister for all French Protestants, Scottish Presbyterians, and English Calvinists in the Caribbean basin. The lady thought that some of the chapters might pertain to what was now Georgia, but in the 1500s and 1600s was called Fleur Française. He speculated that one of the illustrations was of the Track Rock Terrace Complex. I examined the late medieval French text, which is not quite the same as the French I was taught in school. The book definitely had 10 chapters about the native people, history, architecture, religion, flora, and fauna of what is now Georgia. Eventually, I was able to find the English version of the book from 1662 on a British website. It described a very different world in the 17th century Georgia than we were taught in high school. In fact, Georgia history textbooks mention Hernando de Soto, then pretty much skip the 1600s and begin with the founding of the colony of Georgia in 1733. The author of the book described the Kingdom of Appalachia as the most advanced native society north of Mexico. In fact, from a viewpoint of a Christian minister, he thought it was more advanced because Appalachia forbade slavery, human sacrifices, and animal sacrifices. They were monotheistic, worshiping an invisible sun goddess who was essentially a female version of the Hebrew god. Here's the background on the book. In 1653, English royalist Richard Brickstock traveled from the island of Barbados to the Kingdom of Appalachia to determine if it was suitable relocation for English royalists to establish a colony that was not under the jurisdiction of the English Commonwealth. He spent almost a year in northern Georgia and in the region of North Carolina near Franklin. The Appalachia did not permit slavery and required all single Europeans to marry indigenous spouses. For these reasons, Brickstock eventually decided to relocate the colony from Barbados to Virginia. Among much valuable information on the ancestors of the Creek Indians, Brickstock told de Rochefort that the Appalachia believed that golden mica was a form of gold and silver-colored mica was a form of silver. The Appalachia coated the clay stucco on their daub and wattle buildings with crushed mica in order to make them more weather and temperature change resistant. Mayas pressed mica to their lime-based stucco for the same reason. There was no mica in southern Mexico, so that mica probably came from Georgia. After several rains had washed the clay film off the mica, the buildings of golden-colored mica glistened like gold. Those of silver-colored mica glistened like silver. Thus we have the answer to the riddle of why early explorers saw temples that seemed to be coated with gold or silver in northern Georgia. It wasn't gold or silver, it was mica. Without periodic reapplication, the mica would wash away into the soil around the temples. It's certain when the temples became ruins in the 1700s, they'd be completely gone and certainly would not be visible to archaeologists in the 20th century. The capital of Appalachia was described by Richard Brickstock as a town of over 2,000 houses, which were the center of numerous villages and towns clustered around it. Its temples, public buildings, and elite houses glistened like either gold or silver. No such place is mentioned by the British colonists who first settled Georgia in 1733, or even in a Georgia history textbook. No map of the colony or the state of Georgia shows a Native American town named Appalachia. Brickstock mentions something else that could help identify the Native American megapolis. He stated that there was a fortified Spanish trading post near the capital of Appalachia. A small Roman Catholic mission stood nearby. Unfortunately, not one Georgia history book or online reference mentions a Spanish trading post and mission being located in northeast Georgia. Now, most people don't know that Georgia has considerably more Spanish missions and Spanish mission Indians than the much larger state of California, but official maps show them being in the southeastern part of the state, mostly on the Atlantic coast. It seemed to be a dead end. A couple years later, I was reading a back issue of the Florida Anthropologist, a magazine published by the Florida Anthropological Society. It briefly mentioned a road being built from St. Augustine to the southern Appalachians. The statement cited as its source the official Florida State history textbook. This is what I learned from the textbook. In 1646, the Florida governor Benito Ruiz de Salazar Valencia ordered the construction of a road from St. Augustine to the headwaters of the Chattahoochee River, and the construction of a trading post where the road met the river. The road later was extended to the Tennessee River to be opened up to trade with the Upper Creeks living there. A couple of years later, I stumbled upon fascinating information in the official Virginia State history textbook. Later in 1646, Mr. Edward Bland traveled from Jamestown almost immediately after arriving there to a new trading post at the southern tip of the Appalachian Mountains. Bland was a cousin of Richard Brickstock. Now I knew why Brickstock even knew that the kingdom of Appalachia existed. His cousin had already been there. Prior to selling to Jamestown, Bland and his wife had lived in Spain for 5 years, where he exported Spanish wines to England. I searched through the late 17th century European maps, revealed two that answered part of my riddle. Jean-Baptiste Franquelin's 1674 map of eastern North America labeled what is now northeast Georgia Domus Regis, House of the King. There was no other caption anywhere else on the map similar to that one. That had to mean the King of Appalachia. In Franquelin's 1684 version of the map, on the left, he placed 8 large towns on the headwaters of the Chattahoochee River and another large town at the headwaters of the Sooki River to the east. There is still today a large terraced earthen mound at the location. In fact, there are more large towns noted in northeast Georgia on this map than the rest of the map combined. In Robert Borden's 1693 map of North America on the right, he labeled the Nacoochee Valley Appalachia, so we're right on the button. Why didn't the Georgia history books mention these facts about Georgia that were in the Florida's and Virginia's history texts? Why did Georgia, Tennessee, and North Carolina archaeologists show no interest in discovering the villages of 17th century Jewish colonists in their states? I don't know. I eventually found two major exceptions to the riddle concerning the archaeologists. Charles P. Jones, Jr. was a pioneer anthropologist in the Southeast. He is often dissed by contemporary archaeologists because he doesn't have a Ph.D. in anthropology. The fact is that he is essentially minored in anthropology while obtaining a degree in law from Princeton University just before the American Civil War. Princeton was one of 3 universities in North America where the subject was even taught at that time. Jones's landmark book, Southern Antiquities, was published in 1873. He described the discovery of 2 17th century Spanish gold mining villages in the Nacoochee Valley during the 1830s. Both discoveries were thoroughly discovered by Georgia newspapers, but apparently intentionally left out of future Georgia history books. The numerous 16th and 17th century European artifacts discovered by gold miners in northeast Georgia have seemingly disappeared, or at least they are no longer displayed in museums. After graduating from Harvard University with a Ph.D. in anthropology, South Carolinian Robert Wauchop was hired by the Works Progress Administration in 1939 to survey all of northern Georgia. He ended up spending most of the time in the Chattahoochee River Basin, then became the first anthropology professor ever at the University of Georgia. Wauchop moved to the University of North Carolina in 1941, then joined the OSS, forerunner of the CIA, when World War II broke out. He did not return to Georgia until 1959, then published his book on his discoveries in Georgia in 1966. Wauchop found proof that a handful of Roanoke colony survivors, including Ellen Adair, settled in the Nacoochee Valley in 1590. He even found Ellen Adair's tomb, grave markers, and home site. He unearthed dozens of 16th, 17th, and 18th century European artifacts mixed in with Creek Indian-style artifacts while excavating older Native American village sites. He also stated that enough of the European colonial period artifacts were in the possession of local farm families to fill a tractor-trailer truck. In 1833, the United States Congress published an official map of the Georgia gold mining belt. It specifically states that the substantial evidence was found of earlier Spanish gold mining efforts and specifically displays a 17th century Spanish retort used for refining gold. All this information has been intentionally left out of national and Georgia history textbooks to this day. By 2016, I had proof that the heart of the lost Native American civilization was located in the upper Chattahoochee River Basin, and from then on I focused on my research in that area. In 2018, I found a fixer-upper house on the large tract of land in the eastern edge of the Nacoochee Valley and moved there. Since moving to the Nacoochee Valley, all of my research has been at archaeological sites within a 20-minute radius of my house. In fact, all of the sites that you see in the remainder of this program are within a 6-mile radius of my house. Most are within a 3-mile radius. The Nacoochee Valley is located in northeast Georgia, about 90 miles northeast of downtown Atlanta. The Chattahoochee River flows through the valley to the Brevard Fault and then follows the fault southward through metro Atlanta and on to Columbus, Georgia. From there, it generally flows southward to the Gulf of Mexico. The red dots on the map denote major Native American archaeological sites with mounds in northern Georgia. The Nacoochee Valley Archaeological Zone consists of the headwaters basin of the Chattahoochee River that begins at the foot of Trey Mountain in the village of Robertstown, then flows through a valley created by a parallel line of ancient volcanoes. 12 miles or 19.3 kilometers downstream, the river cuts through a gorge, creating class 4, 5, and 6 rapids in the process. Using data from the United States Geological Survey, I created a detailed computer terrain model of the Chattahoochee Headwaters Basin. The volcanic history of this region is very obvious in the model. There are at least 23 obvious cones or calderas in the basin. In 1939, archaeologist Robert Wauchop surveyed the entire Nacoochee Valley. In his book, published in 1966, he described town and village sites that were occupied almost continuously between around 1000 BC and 1700 AD. Some villages of what might be considered neighborhoods were only 100 to 200 yards apart. He determined that the Chattahoochee Headwaters Basin eventually became a densely occupied megapolis. It had a population in the range of 10 to 12,000 people by 1500 AD. He also discovered that individual neighborhoods or villages had differing styles of housing and layouts, reflecting a multi-ethnic composition to the Kingdom of Appalachia. After reading Robert Washup's description of the archaeological sites in the Nacoochee Valley several times, I created a photorealistic virtual reality model of the initial 12 miles of the Chattahoochee River Basin as it looked in 1500 AD. The three-dimensional realism extends to the highest elevations of the basin, including such features as Anaruby Falls near Robertstown. Anywhere one goes in this digital recreation of the past, one will see what the residents of the basin saw in 1500 AD. Here are samples of villages unearthed by Washup that will not be addressed any further in the program. A small village of Arawaks lived in Robertstown next to the ancient mounds built by other peoples. The Spanish trading post was probably nearby. Here's what Alpine Helen, Georgia looked like in 1500 AD. There was a large village around the beloved Nacoochee Mound, which actually originated as a cemetery of stone-sided sepulchres. This is what the mound looks like today. 3,800 feet or 1.15 kilometers to the southeast of the Nacoochee Mound was the village of Huntawasi. It was inhabited by the Appalachian nobility. Note how different their houses were. Huntawasi means descendants of people who irrigate crops. 4,200 feet or 1.3 kilometers to the east was the Eastwood village. We do not know what the name of this village was, but it was the oldest known example of traditional Chickasaw architecture. 4,200 feet east of the Eastwood village was another large village, which archaeologists call the Chattahoochee Stable Village. It was first settled around 1000 or earlier. It probably for 1,000 years was a seasonal campsite for migratory hunters. Immediately to the north was the capital of the Itziti Creeks, the southeast, called Etulamako-Ichiti. Ichiti is also the name that the Itzamayas in Mesoamerica call themselves today. It means Itza people. Other than the locations of the main platforms, smaller mounds, and the stadium, this layout is somewhat speculative. Archaeologist Robert Washup did determine it was densely developed. 1,200 feet to the north of Etulamako-Ichiti was the Lumsden Mound and Village site. 2,850 feet to the northeast of the Lumsden site was the Stovall Mound and Village. This elite village was probably named Chickamauga, which means House of the King in Ichiti Maya. Adjacent Chickamauga Creek gets its name from this large mound. 2 miles to the northeast of the Stovall Mound and at the far eastern extent of the Nacoochee Valley was the original location of the town of Saltee, which means Sooki people in Itchamai, and it's a creek. We now move to the final section of our program, where I will introduce you to the exciting discoveries that I've made in northeast Georgia from 2017 until 2023. These are all sites that were missed by archaeologists Robert Washup and other archaeologists that have come to the valley before and since then. On February 25, 2017, it was a beautiful spring-like day. My 3 dogs and I had cabin fever in the rental cabin near Dahlonega. So we headed eastward to Toccoa, Georgia, in the extreme northeast corner of the state. It was a 65-mile trip through the scenic Blue Ridge foothills country. Up until the Anglo-American occupation of northeast Georgia after the American Revolution, the Unicoi Trail was one of the most important trade routes in the southeast. It connected the head of the freight canoe transportation on the Savannah River with the Nacoochee Valley, the Tennessee River Valley, and the Ohio Valley. It was the fastest route between the heartland of eastern North America and the South Atlantic coast. I'd always wanted to see Travelers Rest Inn and State Historic Site. It's a large log inn constructed in 1795, the year after the Creeks and Cherokees had ceded the northeastern tip of Georgia. Its exterior and interior have been restored to an authentic appearance of a frontier inn. Travelers Rest, throughout its time as an inn, then a residence, was always a farm. After touring the interior, I walked outside to visit surviving agricultural buildings. On the east side of the house, I noticed an open shed structure. There was a stone laying on the ground under the shed. It looked like it had been laying there for 2 centuries. It had. There was a small sign labeling this object a Tugaloo stone. The visitor was told that it had been found by a laborer who was gathering fill stones for foundations and chimneys. This particular stone was found on a rocky knoll overlooking the Tugly River about a quarter mile from the house. The owner of the future inn was intrigued by the carvings on the stone and so decided to keep it as a yard ornament rather than to use it for construction. A brochure stated that the engravings had been determined by anthropology professors at the University of Georgia to be an early form of Cherokee writing. That was pure poppycock. According to maps of the colony of Georgia, this area had been occupied by the Uchis after being occupied by ancestors of the Creek Indians for a couple thousand years. The digital image of that side of the rock looked very different when I saw the images on my computer monitor that evening. Holy Toledo! I saw the same symbols that were endemic on petroglyph boulders along the coast of the Öresund Channel in southern Sweden almost 5 decades earlier. I rotated the image 180 degrees. To my astonishment, I was looking at a typical Scandinavian Bronze Age petroglyphic composition. No one believed me that this was actually found in Georgia. For over 2 centuries, guests at the inn and later university professors had been trying to interpret the rock upside down. While working in Landskrona, I had been required by my employer to audit classes in the medieval, Iron Age, and Bronze Age architectural history of southern Sweden. That was at Lund University. This was because the proposed site of the village was set in the midst of very important archaeological sites from those eras. I contacted the department at Lund University and begged for help. None of the professors believed me when I said that I had discovered petroglyphs identical to those in southern Sweden in the mountains of Georgia. Nevertheless, they emailed me charts which would help me translate the symbols. I returned to Traveller's Rest historic site and obtained permission to photograph all sides of the rock with my digital camera set on infrared. The infrared images, when enhanced by special photo editing software, revealed details that were no longer visible to the human eye. I instantly recognized the engraving of a Swedish Bronze Age heartspring boat. This unique type of craft was featured in the Landskrona City Museum. It couldn't be anything else. Further examination of the images revealed Bronze Age ships from several parts of southern Europe, plus a wide range of European Bronze Age astronomical and navigation symbols. The history of North America was changed forever. One of the most spectacular Native American structures in the United States is virtually unknown to the public and, in fact, is not known to many archaeologists outside of Georgia. Visitors in the Nacoochee Valley in the late 1600s and 1700s spoke of a great pyramid dedicated to the sun god like the ones in New Mexico, overlooking the town of Ishiti. No such pyramid is visible today either in the hamlet of Saltee or in the bottomlands of the Chattahoochee River. Archaeologist Cyrus Thomas in 1886, George J. in 1915, Robert Wauchope in 1939 did absolutely no research into the colonial era archives prior to beginning the excavations in the valley. Wauchope did read Hayes and Thomas's archaeological reports, but both these gentlemen's interpretations of the artifacts unearthed were completely ignorant of the cultural history of this region. All 3 men drove right past the 3 largest mounds in the Nacoochee Valley without stopping to investigate. Since the mounds had mature trees growing on them, all 3 assumed that they were large hills. In fact, I now know that Wauchope excavated a Native American village directly beneath the knoll where this earthen pyramid sat, and didn't notice it. In 1989, an archaeological team from the University of Georgia, led by Professor Mark Williams, dug test holes in a mound on Kinnemer Hill, next to the village of Saltee. They found that the structure was created by carving the lower portions of the hill, then adding the excavated soil on top to make upper terrace. The specific location of the mound was not clear. I began searching for this mound actually in 2008, and then again I went back in 2019 after moving here, but the property was posted and the heavy tree coverage on the hill made it impossible to see any structure whatsoever, no matter the season. A Lidar scan electronically removed the tree cover and quickly located the mound and provided me precise dimensions for creating a virtual reality model of it. It was then that I realized that the Kinnemer Pyramid was identical to structures I'd seen in the highlands of Chiapas, Guatemala, and western Belize. This was, again, more evidence of a Maya settlement in northern Georgia. Indeed, when the valley was fully settled by Native Americans, the Kinnemer Pyramid would have had a dramatic dominance over the entire valley, it did look like the pyramids in Mexico. Here you see three more views of the Canopy Pyramid derived from the Upper Chattahoochee River virtual reality three-dimensional model. It is an ancient stone masonry structure on the crest of Alec Mountain in northwestern Habersham County, Georgia, 4 miles or 4.3 kilometers east of the Nacoochee Valley. This architectural monument was a popular regional tourist attraction from the early 1840s to the mid-1970s. Today, very few people, including those living at the foot of Alec Mountain, even know that it exists. At the time when the first Anglo-American pioneers settled in the Nacoochee Valley, the walls of the structure were about 6 to 7 feet tall. Ever since then, local families have been hauling away stones for fireplaces from the structure, but it's still 3 to 4 feet tall. In 1849, Charles Landman, a professional librarian, author, and explorer, visited the site. Afterwards, he wrote that no one knew who had built the old stone fort near the Nacoochee Valley. The last Indians in the valley had no idea who had constructed it. In 1883, it was studied by the chief archaeologist of the Smithsonian Institute, Cyrus Thomas, and described in an article published by the United States Bureau of Ethnology in 1891. In 1956, it was studied, surveyed, and documented by archaeologist Philip E. Smith of the Peabody Museum of Harvard University. His report was published by the University of Georgia and still may be downloaded online. It is doubtful that any living archaeologist in Georgia has seen the structure. Not many more even know it exists. When Helen, Georgia was remodeled as an alpine village in the late 1960s, the stone ring was listed in brochures as a must-see tourist attraction for vacationers in the Georgia mountains. Its mention stayed on the brochures until around 1980. I contacted the Helen Visitor Center about the stone ring. Not one person in the office had a clue what I was talking about. Philip Smith stated in his report that the archaeological site was maintained in pristine condition by a local Boy Scout group. Calls to local Boy Scout troops and the Northeast Georgia Regional Council ran into a brick wall. No one had ever heard of the stone ring, and no one knew which Boy Scout troop maintained the site or why they stopped maintaining it after taking care of it for many decades. My fear was that the ancient structure was no longer existed. Over and over again during the 20th century, Georgia Highway Department intentionally hauled off ancient stone ruins in North Georgia to be crushed into gravel. In eyesight of Alec Mountain, they scooped up a huge mound around 50 feet tall to use as topsoil for highway construction projects. I found one elderly woman who had grown up next to Alec Mountain. She told me that back in the 1970s, the county road department had rebuilt Alec Mountain Road. The new grade cut across the access from a parking lot to the trail going up the mountains. There was no way to drive a car into the parking lot. As far as she knew, no one had hauled away the stones, but people stopped going to the site once the parking lot was no longer accessible. Nothing was visible on the mountain's top or crest. The trees were just too dense. It was impossible to see anything with satellite imagery. The same problem. The tree foliage concealed all details at ground level. Eventually I obtained access to the USGS Lidar scan for Georgia mountains and immediately zeroed on Alec Mountain. It was in pristine condition. Even the ditches dug by the archaeologist Philip Smith were still visible with Lidar. There was an unexpected bonus. Immediately to the east of Alec Mountain was a lower knoll that turned out to be the location of a massive wall that seems to be some type of town site. It's on private land, so it'll be a while before we can find out what exactly is there. The next problem was getting access to the site. Letters to the property owners, which all were family trusts, received no response. I finally was tipped off that one adjacent property owner had access to the stone ruins. He took me to see them in his ATV. The next day I bought back a camera and a video camera, but it was impossible to photograph or tape the entire site because of all the terraces and the dense tree growth. So a better way to see the Alec Mountain Stone Oval is a series of virtual reality models that I created for you, the viewers. I'll now take you on the tour of the site as it probably looked when it was first created, and we don't know who did the creating. The structure is aligned to the sun, so that it's a few degrees difference between true north-south and magnetic north-south on modern maps. Note the slot in the wall in the foreground. It is aligned to the winter solstice sunset. That has great significance for calendrical measurements. Here you see the profile of it. The structure was on a 10-degree slope approximately. That's very unusual. I've never seen that before, and it must have had astronomical purpose. Here you see another angle view looking back towards the Alec Mountains, and the slope is very obvious. This view looks westward across the Amos Creek Valley and Amos Creek Valley, then to Sal Mountain, and beyond that is Yonah Mountain, two extinct volcanoes. Here we see a view looking northward. I assumed that they'd clear the path in the trees for observations, but that is just a guess. It's pure speculation. Here's a view looking south towards some low mountains, and beyond that is the Georgia Piedmont. I do not know of any other structure in Georgia or even North America that is similar to this one. However, we do find such structures elsewhere. They're in the eastern highlands of Scotland, and they date from the period from 3500 to 3000 BC. Notice that this one also has a slot facing the winter solstice sunset. Now, Philip Smith, the archaeologist, did not find any artifacts at the Alec Mountain Oval Ring. There's nothing that we can associate with a specific culture anywhere. It'll remain to be seen if they ever again be able to find the date of the structure or who built it. Shortly after the founding of Charleston, South Carolina in 1671, word reached the colonists on the coast of a powerful and sophisticated native people living on the southern edge of the mountains called the Sooki. At that time, Great Britain claimed the territory of Carolina included all of present-day Georgia north of the mouth of the Altamaha River. They were said to be the most advanced native people north of Mexico, had many cultural traits that were typical of Mexico, other than the fact that they did not practice human sacrifice. What I believe the actual situation was that the Sooki, as a part of the kingdom of Appalachia, was closest to the Carolina colonists. Traders did not distinguish between the Sooki and their equally advanced neighbors. Their religious capital was called Sooki and was located on a river that flowed out of the mountains. Their political capital, Sooki, was farther downstream, where Clarksville, Georgia, is located today. This is a detail of Jean-Baptiste Franquelin's 1684 map of North America. Sooki and numerous towns appear there on the Upper Chattahoochee River and Sooki River. Obviously, French traders had visited this region. By the time that John Herbert created this first map of South Carolina in 1725, the Sooki Province had shrunken to a capital town now called Sooki and two villages farther downstream on the Sooki River. Only Sooki and Sooki are shown on this 1810 map of Georgia. Obviously, the population of the Sooki people had shrunk substantially in the past century. In 2014, I first read of the numerous ruins in the Sooki River Basin while reading Roger Washup's archaeological survey of northern Georgia. Washup did not start writing the book until 21 years after he left Georgia. This caused some problems. He forgot where he was. He described fascinating stone ruins and now unknown mounds near the hamlet of Saltee that were discovered in 1886 by Smithsonian archaeologists Cyrus Thomas and John Rogan. They included a large stone veneered pyramid and stone-walled U-shaped ball court. They were described as being adjacent to the Saltee post office. Washup could not find a town named Sooki, so he thoroughly searched the Saltee community. He did not find a pyramidal mound, a U-shaped ball court there with stone walls, but he did find a large U-shaped stadium with terrace seating. In October 2013, I quickly was able to find the stadium in plain view. Kids were playing soccer on it. The stadium is part of the Saltee Nacoochee Community Center campus. The east side has been partially clipped off by a widening of State Highway 255. Both state and federal laws require an archaeological review of possible impact of transportation improvements. on all designated archaeological sites. Obviously, this was not done. In April 2017, I gave a standing room only presentation of the archaeological sites discovered by Robert Washup at the Saltee Nacoochee Community Association Auditorium. The response of the organization was to grade down part of the 10-century-old stadium as landscape improvements. I found a digital copy of the 1891 Bureau of Ethnology report on Northeast Georgia. Thomas and Rogan studied Saltee and Sooki. They studied the Nacoochee Mound, then went on horseback to Saltee, then to Sooki. Thomas's description of Saltee's terrain was very different than today's Saltee. His description of the hamlet of Sooki was very vague. By looking at historic United States Geological Survey maps, I finally figured out what had changed on the landscape. In 1886, Saltee was 3 miles northeast of where it's located today. Colonial maps showed a Sooki at the intersection of 2 trade paths. Early 19th century maps of Georgia showed a town named Sooki at the intersection of 2 wagon roads, which obviously were developed from the trade paths. That was the same location as the hamlet of Batesville, Georgia today. In 1818, the original location of Clarksville, the county seat, was on the Tallulah River, about 3 miles northeast of Batesville. By that time, the Indian village had been abandoned. By 1830, Clarksville had been relocated to its current location in the center of the county, and a new village of white settlers was forming at the same location as the former Native American village, and it was called Sooki also. In 1855, the village of Sooki changed its name to Batesville in honor of the new postmaster. Then in 1874, when the Batesville General Store was constructed, the town changed its name back to Sooki. In 1901, Sooki changed its name back to Batesville, and at the same time, Saltee moved 3 miles to the southwest to its current location, where the new Nacoochee Academy was being constructed. You can see why Robert Washup and I were very confused. Using the restaurant at the old Batesville General Store as my base, I searched the countryside for a terraced pyramidal mound. Not anywhere could it be seen. Giving up finding the site the old-fashioned way, I paid $340 for a Lidar scan of Batesville. There were mounds and agricultural terraces under the tree canopy. Then I took a close look. The Batesville General Store was on Terrace 3 of a pyramidal mound covering 7 acres. This is the first CAD model I created based on the Lidar. In the process, discovered another oval stone ring aligned perfectly with the one on Alec Mountain. Later that winter, I discovered that the pyramid still had some of its stone veneer on it, particularly on the side nearest the store. The local residents evidently had taken most of the stones to build chimneys, hearths, and foundations. Also with Lidar, I discovered that an extensive terracing and irrigation system to the southeast, in particular, of the pyramid, and also some smaller mounds. The temple on the top of the largest pyramid had an excellent view of Chimney Mountain to the northwest, which periodically belches smoke, steam, or hot gases. This was definitely one of those situations that the snake was so close it could have bit me. When I first started using Google Maps in 2012, this unusual terrain was barely noticeable. Year by year, Google Maps achieved increasingly higher resolution. I began noticing a strange shape next to the Nacoochee United Methodist Church. Then the 2022 version of Google Maps clearly showed an earth form that seemed man-made, perhaps carved out of a hill. I obtained a U.S. Geological Survey Lidar, which was even more precise. It portrayed the Itzamaya sky serpent god. Oh my gosh. At ground level, one sees nothing unusual. This is the view from the banks of the Chattahoochee River to the south. From the air, though, this strange earthwork is visible. A friend flew his airplane over it and said that at an angle, the unusual terrain feature is even more obvious. I used U.S. Geological Survey data to create a computer model, which removed the damage to the structure done by highway construction and a house. The structure is 2,000 feet or 619 meters north to south and 1,200 feet or 366 meters west to east. At its highest point is 51 feet or 15.5 meters high. The Itzamaya sky serpent is generally assumed to represent a comet or a meteor coming down to Earth because of the tail, but it's also one facet of a traditional form of Greek art derived from the form of a spiral galaxy. In 2013, I was asked by a client to measure and draw a stone pile effigy of two sky serpents. It is located in southwestern Indiana near the Ohio River. In the architectural renderings of the sky serpent using Atlantis software, I presumed that at one point it was coated with gold-tinted mica or perhaps fool's gold. This bird's eye view looks southward. This lateral view looks eastward. In the foreground was a stone circle on a knoll overlooking the Nacoochee River floodplain, and it now overlooks the Nacoochee United Methodist Church Cemetery. In this view, the sky serpent seems to be looking at the top of Nacoochee Mountain, whose name was changed to Yonah Mountain by settlers from North Carolina in the 1830s. Nacoochee is the Creek and Chickasaw word for bear, while Yonah means a large bear or grizzly bear in the Cherokee language. What was the sky serpent used for? Why was it built at that spot? These are good questions which I can't answer. It could be that a meteorite fell at that spot or a chunk of comet exploded over that spot. There's one other explanation that should be mentioned. It is obviously a very long ramp leading up to a round platform. There's a Creek tradition that there was once 3 stargates in what is now Georgia. In the Nacoochee Valley, where I live, on top of the Spiral Mound at Okmulgee National Historical Park in Macon, Georgia, and at the town of Wahalatsi near present-day Alberta, Georgia on the Savannah River. The extraterrestrials visited frequently and sometimes mated with the local folks. This suggestion is pure speculation, but the sky serpent could be a stargate or else a landing pad that could be easily seen from space. As Special Agents Fox Mulder and Donna Scully frequently said on the X-Files, the truth is out there somewhere. Bye folks, I hope you enjoyed my introduction to the Nacoochee Valley's amazing heritage. Now I'm taking off for a vacation in the Pleiades. Y'all be good here.